there are two major issues that we must deal with, or else nothing else matters. One of them is the threat of nuclear war, which is increasing. Second is the imminent destruction of an environment that can sustain life. We're proceeding towards both catastrophes.
Thanks for tuning in to our latest installment of the Expert Series. The CDA Institute recently sat down with American linguist, activist, philosopher, and political analyst Noam Chomsky. One of the most cited scholars alive, Chomsky has influenced a broad array of academic fields. He is widely recognized as having helped to spark the cognitive revolution in the human sciences, and is one of the most famous critics of US foreign policy. We interviewed Professor Chomsky on a range of current issues, including the impact of the crisis of American democracy for Canadian security. Chomsky discusses some of the factors that have resulted in the decline of American democracy, elaborates upon his positions regarding the war in Ukraine and the Western response, and reflects on the geopolitics of the 1930s and the similar challenges we face today. Professor Chomsky, it is a tremendous honor to host you today. Truly a great privilege. Thank you for joining me. I'd like to start by discussing what some have deemed the crisis of American democracy and what impacts it has on Canadian security. Academics like Thomas Homer Dixon have speculated that the United States could succumb to dictatorship as early as the end of the decade. What contingency plans should or could Canada have in place to prepare for a future in which our closest ally is potentially an existential threat to our very sovereignty and security?
Well, Canada could try to move to some part of the world that's not subject to US policies, if they can find one. Not much to do. I mean, Canada has traditional Canadian foreign policy, like Australia's. New Zealand has been what's called sub-imperialism. You basically go along with the United States, whether you like it or not, because you don't have a lot of choices. You may remember a statement by a Canadian diplomat, I think it was John Holmes, who described what he called the Canadian idea. Canadian idea is to stand up for our principles and to find a way around them. Okay, everyone else's idea too. Talk about your principles, but you don't believe a word of them. And you can demonstrate that so easily in statecraft that it's hardly worth wasting time on it. The United States, of course. So, for example, the United States now and Europe and Canada are very outraged by Putin's effort to occupy another country. Can't allow occupation, except when we endorse it. Then you can do it. Like, say, US endorsement of Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights, Greater Jerusalem, in violation of Security Council orders, which US supported. But we can somehow find a way around our principles when it's convenient to do so. Same on just about every other issue. Can't tolerate autocracy unless we can send a lot of arms to them and make a ton of money, like Saudi Arabia. Then we can tolerate it just fine. Canada, of course, is in a very vulnerable position. There's a famous comment about Mexico, which you've probably heard. It says Mexico's problem is that it's too close to the United States and too far from God, meaning internal problems. Well, same is true in Canada. It's so there aren't a lot of options. I mean, I think there are things Canada could do which would be meaningful. Could, for example, join the treaty, the International Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Production. Already has 120 or so members, it's in force. That would not end nuclear weapons in the world, but it would be a symbolic step of no little significance. It could lead further. For example, one of the ways to we have to get rid of nuclear weapons or else we're going to destroy ourselves. I mean, the record of the past 70 years. It's just a miracle that we've survived this far, if only from accidents. Well, you can't get rid of them in one shot, but you can reduce the possibilities of their use. One way is to restore the arms control regime that had been virtually eviscerated by the Republican administrations of this century, primarily Trump, first Bush, then Trump. And that can be restored and expanded. You can expand nuclear weapons-free zones. They exist in many parts of the world. None of them can be enforced because the US blocks all of them. There's an African zone. It's blocked by the US and Britain, which insist on counter to Security Council United Nations orders, insist on keeping British sovereignty in an African island so that the US can use it as a base for bombing Central Asia and maintaining nuclear weapons. Same in the Pacific. There's a Pacific zone. US insists on nuclear installations that can't go into effect. Well, there's one in the Western Hemisphere. Right now, there's two countries that block it, can reduce it to one country. That's of symbolic significance. It goes on. But all of these things cut away at the legitimacy of the efforts to destroy human civilization. And that every one of those steps is significant. So there's things that can be done even if they don't explicitly change policy. I would simply stress again the two issues I began with, which are of such overwhelming importance that unless we keep them front and center, nothing else is going to matter. One is ending the threat of nuclear war. There cannot be a nuclear war. It'll be essentially terminal. The other is immediately, without delay, moving forward, step by step, substantive steps every year to address the existential problem of destruction of the environment. We don't have a lot of time. We know how to do it. There are means that would accomplish it. The longer we delay, the more the window is closed. We have to move expeditiously. Everything else has to be subordinated to that, or else nothing else is going to matter.
From your view, what has the impact of the January 6th insurrection been on American politics? What are some of the factors responsible for the current perceived crisis of American democracy?
The crisis goes back a long way. It goes back really to the 1970s. By the 1970s, the two political parties, which are not really that different, they're both business parties with somewhat different emphasis. So back in the 1960s, you couldn't tell a moderate Republican from a moderate Democrat. They're almost interchangeable. I voted for Republicans back in the 60s. It's inconceivable now. Starting in the 1960s, both parties underwent a change. This was part of larger factors taking place in the global economy. The Republicans simply went off the rails. By now, they're not a political party in any ordinary sense. That's been well recognized by leading political commentators. So 10 years ago, two major political analysts of the American Enterprise Institute, Conservative Institute, Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann, wrote that the Republicans have become a radical insurgency, rejecting the methods of parliamentary democracy. It's become much more extreme since. It actually starts with Nixon. Nixon was a serious politician, whatever you think about him. he understood that Republicans cannot win votes by approaching their electorate with their actual policies. The policies are, we want to screw you. We want to support the extreme rich and the corporate sector. Whatever happens to you, can't get votes that way, obviously. So you have to try to divert attention to other matters, not our actual policies. Like the Trump administration doesn't approach voters by saying, our one legislative achievement has been to rob you blind, namely the highly regressive tax cut. You can't approach voters that way. So you turn to other issues. Well, for Nixon, it was what was called the Southern strategy. The Democrats had supported civil rights legislation in the 60s. Nixon and his strategists understood that if the Republicans came across with a not too hidden racist message, I won't say it outright, they could win Southern Democratic votes, which worked. By the mid-70s, Republican strategists, Paul Weiser mainly, recognized that if the Republicans pretended, I stress pretended, to be opposed to abortion, they could pick up the huge evangelical vote and the Northern Catholic vote. So they all switched on a dime. Reagan had been governor of California, supported one of the strongest pro-choice measures, suddenly became passionately anti-abortion. H.W. Bush, all the rest of them. Later, they recognized that if they started yelling about guns, they could pick up another sector. And it continues that way. So turn to so-called cultural issues, keep away from the actual policies. Well, that's the Republicans. And meanwhile, they're just kind of totally gone crazy. You can see it in the January 6th hearings. What about the Democrats? In the 70s, they abandoned the working class, handed them over to their class enemy. Democrats became a party of wealthy professionals, lawyers, doctors, academics, mostly socially liberal, but no class orientation, weren't interested. The kind of people who show up at Obama's fancy parties, that's the Democrats, plus the Wall Street orientation, Clinton Democrats. Working class is left on its own, no support. So they're easy prey to the cultural issues as they are under attack, and they're under severe attack. I mean, you take a look at the neoliberal programs that have taken off since Reagan. They've had an impact. Actually, the Rand Corporation, highly respectable corporation, tried to give a measure of it. They estimated that in the past 40 years, the transfer of wealth from the middle class and working class to the very top wealthy 1% is about $50 trillion. It's not small potatoes, and it shows up in many ways. One of the ways is that people are susceptible to these to ideas that are so outlandish that I can hardly repeat them. Like about a half of Republicans think that the Democratic Party is run by sex perverts who are trying to groom children for sexual abuse. 70% think the election was stolen. These people who rioted on January 6th were honest. They believed they were defending democracy from a crazed cabal that had stolen it. I mean, when people have beliefs like that, rational discussion is almost impossible. And the Democrats have offered nothing. Under the Biden administration, there actually were progressive proposals that could have met people's needs. They were basically coming out of Bernie Sanders' office in the Senate Budget Committee, all shut down. 100% rock-ribbed Republican opposition, a couple of right-wing Democrats. So nothing could pass. And the results, which are very harmful, are blamed on the Democrats. Unreasonably, but you can understand why. Well, you want to know where the country's going? They're taking over. They already have a Supreme Court, which is a throwback to the 19th century. And they'll presumably take Congress. Next president will either be somebody like Trump or maybe Trump himself or somebody like him. For Canada, this is a very serious problem. You can't escape the effects of what happens in the United States.
Professor Chomsky, I'm hoping to switch gears now to another topic, and that is the war in Ukraine, to which you've commented on quite frequently in the media. What do you see as a realistic diplomatic solution to end the war in Ukraine? What does a negotiated settlement or peace agreement look like in your mind? I'm wondering if you can dive a bit into specifics.
Before the invasion, there was a pretty clear framework for a diplomatic settlement. Ukraine was more or less supporting it as well. It involved a number of components. One was neutralization of Ukraine, meaning Ukraine would have a status rather like, say, Canada. I mean, if Canada were to leave NATO, it would become like Mexico, for example. So take Mexico, that's neutralized. There's no treaty, but it's understood on all sides that Mexico cannot join a hostile military alliance, say, run by China, and put heavy weapons aimed at the United States on the Mexican border. You don't need a treaty to block that. It's just out of the question. Status rather like Austria during the entire Cold War. So that was one element, an element actually advocated by high US diplomatic officials going back to George Kennan up until including the directors of the CIA. So that was one part. Second part was some form of autonomy for the Donbass region, the Russia-oriented region. Before the invasion could have been, and in fact, Russia had even supported this not long back, autonomy within a Ukrainian federation. That would be something like, say, Switzerland or Belgium, or even to a limited extent, the United States federal structure. A third element was Crimea. It's a simple fact, whether we like it or not, that there is no way for Ukraine to take Crimea. Zelensky recognized this indirectly by saying, let's put it off the table for the time being, settle the immediate problems, we'll turn to that later. Well, that was the basis for a negotiated settlement prior to the invasion. How much of that still remains is an open question. Once military operations take place, the stakes get higher. Participants who might have been willing to accept something become less willing to do so. Well, how much of that remains? Again, there is only one way to find out. Try. The US, with Canada as usual, tailing behind politely, is rejecting negotiations flat out. After the invasion, State Department conceded that the US had never been willing to discuss Russian security concerns. NATO membership, that's basically saying no negotiations. That's become a stricter position in the months that followed. the Ramstein meeting a couple of weeks ago, the US called together the NATO powers, some others, and basically laid down the line. The line is, our goal is to harm Russia, to harm it severely enough so that it can never undertake further aggression, which means no negotiations, means the war goes on indefinitely till Ukraine is destroyed. That's basically the Western position, US position. It was taken a step forward yesterday with the NATO summit.
There seems to be a popular sentiment that providing Putin with an out or an escape hatch would be tantamount to appeasement. What do you make of assessments such as this? How would you respond?
Another term for it is diplomacy. Diplomacy, by definition, has an element of appeasement. Diplomacy means a settlement which is tolerable to both sides, even if they don't like it. Doesn't meet their maximal goals, but they can live with it. Okay, that's diplomacy. You can call it appeasement if you like, because neither side gets everything it wants, but it's diplomacy. So as a point of logic, can't debate it, there will either be a diplomatic settlement or there won't. That much is not debatable. If there isn't a diplomatic settlement, it means the war goes on until one side capitulates. There's no reason to anticipate that Russia will capitulate. If it ever comes to a problem on the battlefield, which doesn't look very likely, they can always resort to the weapons which we all know that they have and devastate Ukraine. So the chances of Russian capitulation are very slight, which means either we have diplomacy or further destruction of Ukraine with all the side effects that are taking place around the world. Well, what's diplomacy? It has to afford Putin some kind of escape hatch. That's by definition. Doesn't do that, it's capitulation. And there's no reason to expect them to capitulate. All of this is so elementary. It's basically logic. People don't like it. You want to strike heroic postures about no appeasement. Okay, what you're saying is, let's kill more Ukrainians, unless you have an alternative. And nobody has an alternative because there isn't any. So either you have an escape hatch or further destruction, devastation with all the side effects. You want to kill a lot of Ukrainians? Okay, it's a good position. If you don't accept the diplomatic settlement, then you are saying the war goes on until one side capitulates. Well, if we delay negotiations, Ukraine will be in a better position to negotiate. Facts are exactly the opposite. We see them right in front of us on the ground. As you delay, Russian forces concentrating in the eastern area are slowly moving forward, using their massive advantages in heavy artillery, very destructive. And if, as some claim possible, let's say, if Ukraine were to move forward and inflict a potential defeat on Russia, they will almost certainly resort to the weapons that they have not used, against which there's no defense. So it's taking a tremendous gamble with the fate of Ukraine. I think that gamble is highly immoral, but if the Ukrainian economists want to take it, it's their choice.
Well, Professor Chomsky, it's been a delight speaking with you today. Before we wrap up, I have one final question for you. You wrote your first essay at the age of 10, which detailed the fall of Barcelona and the spread of fascism in Europe. You have said that from your 10-year-old point of view, it looked as though the world was coming to an end, as if fascism was uncontrollable. When you look at today's challenges, from revisionist authoritarian countries to pandemics and climate change, how do we avoid losing control? I'm curious how your 10-year-old perspective contrasts with your perspective now.
Well, the 10-year perspective did not have any deep understanding of what was happening, but the general contours were clear enough. Successively, countries of Europe were collapsing under the Nazi threat. Italy had, of course, preceded it. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Munich, a couple of months before that article. The fall of Barcelona meant that Spain fell to fascism. It was a major step, and it looked inexorable. Where's it going to go? Well, turns out that US analysts, I didn't know it at the time, were looking at the world pretty much the same way, considering the possibility that the conflicts of the day might end up with two world systems, a German-run Eurasia and an American-run, what they called Grand Area, British Empire, which the US would take over in the Western Hemisphere, parts of Asia. Well, looking at the world today, it's kind of ironic for someone my age. By the 1930s, mid-30s, Europe was descending to fascism, and it went all the way. The United States, in contrast, under the pressure of a revitalized militant labor movement, was pioneering social democracy. That was the New Deal, which in the post-war era was kind of a model for the spread of much of the social democratic successes of later years. You look at it today, it's almost reversed. The United States is moving towards a kind of Christian nationalist proto-fascism, regressing to much earlier period of civilization. Europe is more or less hanging on to elements of social democracy, also under attack. So there is more than a little irony as to where the world is going. Looks very dangerous. I mean, there are, beyond discussion, there are two major issues that we must deal with, or else nothing else matters. One of them is the threat of nuclear war, which is increasing. Second is the imminent destruction of an environment that can sustain life. We're proceeding towards both catastrophes. Going back to Ukraine, one of its extremely harmful, if not devastating effects, has been to accelerate the move towards both of these crises. Side effect, criminal invasion, devastating for Ukraine, but also these side effects on the world.